funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
In the 1880s, much of Ireland, in particular the western seaboard, was mired in desperate poverty. And it wasn't an attempt to try and do something to address this problem that in the year 1888 a young English Quaker woman named Sophia Sturge came to Letterfrack in Connemara, where she established a basket industry, giving training and employment to many. This is her story, the story of Sophia Sturge in Connemara.
Sophia Sturge, she went to Letterfrack.
She set about attempting to re-establish the basket industry here in Letterfrack, and she succeeded.
I think it was a very forward-thinking project.
By the first year they'd made over 1,000 baskets. They were selling them.
The factory in Letterfrack making high quality and very high quality baskets.
She was very keen to give employment.
Sophia Sturge was actually employing people and training them as well in a skill, and her idea was that people would have the skill.
It was fantastic while it lasted. I mean, it employed a whole village of people.
It was very important when it was there.
A lady came to Letterfrack from the city of Birmingham to weave a spell where hardship fell with a keen industrious plan to open the door with work for the poor and raise up her fellow man.
And before we hear how exactly Sophia Sturge ended up in Letterfrack in Connemara, well, first here's Joan Johnson of the Quaker Historical Committee of Ireland to explain Sophia Sturge's roots.
Sophia Sturge was born in Birmingham in 1849. Now, 1849 was the time when the famine in Ireland was... People were on their knees after the famine.
It was raging, literally.
Yes, yeah. And she was the daughter of Joseph. Joseph Sturge was again a successful Quaker businessman in Birmingham. And he led a very interesting life. He was a social reformer and interested in the welfare of his own community, but in particular in the anti-slavery movement. And in fact, so much so that they never ate sugar as a protest for the anti-slavery movement, and as did a lot of Quakers. And this was because out in the West Indies there were plantations of sugar, and the Negroes, the local people there, were being paid nothing. They were slaves, really. And so the Quakers, along with others, campaigned so that this would become illegal, and eventually it did. But Joseph Sturge was one of them, and his response for that particular campaign was to go out to Montserrat. Here's a bit of research for you. You can go to Montserrat, and he bought himself a plantation, and he paid the slaves the fair rate. Now, that was huge. Now, could you imagine how popular he was out there with others? And so they just practiced what they preached.
But it wasn't just Sophia Sturge's father who sought to help those less well off than himself. Sophia's mother, Hannah, also played her part, including helping famine victims during the Finnish famine of 1857 to 58. Dr. Andrew Newby, Senior Research Fellow in European Area and Cultural Studies at the University of Helsinki in Finland.
Hannah Sturge, who was Joseph Sturge's wife, was remembered actually in Finland as a great heroine of the famine period because she donated money to a parish in the east of Finland. It was said that she stopped taking butter on her bread for a certain period and then saved that money up and sent it to the starving people in this parish called Hurunsalmi. And in the local newspaper it said that Hannah Sturge is the most wonderful woman and that the children of the parish would just learn so much from this wonderful example of philanthropy.
As Sophia Sturge grew up, her two parents, Joseph and Hannah, became her role models. Their life example helped to instill in her a strong sense of social justice. That with wealth came responsibilities, especially to the poor. Historian Joan Johnson.
Sophia was up in this nice house, but there was a gap. She was still wanting to try and find what she should try to find a meaningful contribution. And being from a fairly wealthy family, she would have travelled a lot, and she travelled to Ireland as a lot of people from Great Britain did, and they toured, and we have quite a few diaries of people who've come to the West and admired the lakes and the lovely mountains and all that. But she came along and she'd heard about the West and the Destitution, and she travelled in 1887 over here, and she travelled down to Letterfrack.
1887 was her first visit, and when she got here, 1880s was a very bad time in Connemara. I mean, an awful lot of people look at the 1840s and think that, it didn't get any worse, and I suppose it didn't really, but the 1880s were a very good close second.
Connemara local historian Brendan O'Scannall.
And all through the 1880s there was a lot of destitution and problems throughout the west of Ireland, and Letterfrack again seemed to be the kind of a centre. There was a lot of different things happening there. So I think when she came to have a visit, she realised that there was a lot of problems there and needed to be sorted out.
But the biggest problem being the dire economic situation in Connemara. Dr. Jerry Moran, historian and research fellow at the Social Science Research Centre in NUI, Galway.
In terms of the economic activity is very, very limited during this particular period. There's problems in relation to paying rent, because many of them are still tenants paying to landlords, even though the rents have been reduced by the land courts. But still, on account of the recession in agriculture, many of them are unable to pay rents, or even what many of them are actually living on at this particular stage is credit being provided by shopkeepers.
Certainly from looking at reports and looking at different newspaper articles about Connemara at the time, you can see that in the early 1880s was very, very, not just poverty, but there was an awful lot of, I suppose, hatred among people as well. People were just pushed down so much that they were kind of desperate, and that was a kind of a very bad situation for anybody to become desperate. I mean, you can be poor and you can be fairly okay, but when you get to this situation where there is no hope for you at all and things really go wrong, that society kind of breaks down a bit.
And witnessing at first hand the destitution of many people in Connemara, Sophia realised that good intentions were useless unless backed up by actions. Brendan O'Scannall.
She thought, well, she needed to do something practical to help people as well. It was easy to throw money at people, but you have to actually kind of give them something as well to look forward to and actually to live for.
So what would she do? How could she devise some plan? And she was travelling, I think, with a friend in Italy, and she was passing nearby Florence, and there's a lovely village called Prato, and in that village she saw basket work being done in a cottage industry environment. All the little cottage people were doing basket work. There was willows outside, stacked outside the windows of the cottages. When she went inside, and she did to make inquire, there were baskets and there was chairs and there was tables, and I think she even saw curtains made of basket work. So she came back and she was fired up with this idea, and she hadn't a clue how to make the stuff at all.
And although at this early stage Sophia Sturge hadn't a clue about how to do basketry, nevertheless she did realise its potential to help a community such as Letterfrack. But first she needed training. Joan Johnson.
She was a very determined lady, so she knocked on the door of the blind asylum school in Birmingham to see if she could be taught. But they had no time, they were full up. But she was overheard by this old gentleman, and he said, look, if you really, really want to know, I'll teach you in my time off. And so she was taught the basics there. So she'd go up and get taught in the evenings. And so she got the basics. And there's a very interesting story. It just shows you how determined she was. She was in the school and she was looking up at an old dusty old shelf, and she saw this sort of brick there, and it was covered over with sort of basket work, but it was obviously a mould of some description, and she noticed the basket work was very fine, and she got them to pull it down, and she said, they said, we don't do that work anymore. The person who used to teach it has gone or has died, and she's no more, and we don't know how to work it. But she was fascinated in that it seemed to be a mould that they could actually work around the basket and build it up, and it seemed to make a very nice basket. And so she made inquiries, and off she went to France, and she went to this place, which was another basket making place, and she went there, and to make a long story short, she found this working model that she'd seen in Birmingham in the blind asylum over there, and she was taught how to do it. So she now knew how to do coarse basket work and this finer work. And the coarse work would be for sort of turf baskets and stuff like that, I imagine she was thinking of. And the finer work would be for little baskets for the desk and stuff like that, and maybe for hankies or jewellery and finer work.
Well, she finally, I suppose, arrived in September 1888, and at that particular time throughout the west of Ireland there was an awful lot of emphasis on training, and she was very much involved in that. If you read the reports of Congested Districts Board, you'll see that in various places like the schools down in South Connemara, etc., they were doing kind of net making for fishing and all that kind of stuff. So the idea was to actually kind of train people in skills that were going to be useful. And I think the Congested Districts Board, who she was kind of involved in all throughout, really kind of tried to push that idea. And I think she herself looked at that it was important to have people skilled in the job, not just giving them kind of work as such. And her classes started very slowly. She started at the courthouse, which was the meeting house originally there.
Historian Brendan O'Scanall. Here's Letterfrack local historian Pádraig Lydon to continue the story.
She set about training the young people, and she had classes both for boys and for girls. And she came to Letterfrack, and she got a room in the Temperance Hotel that was here then, and part of the Temperance Hotel, it seems, was the courthouse. So she used that area for her classes, and she eventually was so successful. She started off with one boy.
And once she got started, a number of people took place. I think it seems to be one or two at the beginning, and then it really blossomed as people realised that this was a chance to better themselves and have a better chance. And I think, once they realised that she wasn't kind of on the make, because I suppose they have actually had experienced that from other people as well, that she was genuine, they said, to join into it. The industry got started and people started doing work and got money. That led one led thing to the other, and people really got interested in doing it.
To Connemara's rocky land, Sophia made her way. In hungry times where hardship chimes, remembered still to this day. To weave a track to Letterfrack and offer a fair week's pay.
She went to Letterfrack, she got up and going. By the first year they'd made over 1,000 baskets.
Historian Joan Johnson of the Quaker Historical Committee of Ireland.
They were selling them little baskets for 1 shilling and larger ones for 3 shillings. And she was marketing them. She made her own emblem and had the Letterfrack name on it, and she had a little bird on the top, I think a peace bird, and she'd put that on, stick it on, and she'd send those off back to London and to her friends in Birmingham, and they'd buy them. And so she was paying her trainees, and if they sold something, then they would get the money. So gradually, money was starting to circulate, as it were.
I'd also say that people were very, very glad of any employment opportunity.
Joe Hogan, Connemara basket maker and also author of the book Basket Making in Ireland.
You know that coming up from Ross Row there, people now call it the Famine Road, but you know that walkway that comes up from Ross Row, so that would have been fairly close by there, and that was built. The reason they call it the Famine Road is because it was built as part of the Congested Districts Relief Board works. They didn't want to give money for doing nothing, as they thought of it. You know, it was very much part of their ethic that you had to work for the money. So I think it was a very poor area generally, but I think some of the basket makers didn't come from just Letterfrack. They came west of the peninsula, the Renville Peninsula, Tully Cross and stuff like that.
From Quaker stock of servitude, devoted piety, to basket making in the hills, to set the destitute free. With a firm desire to raise them higher, with willow her industry.
And as Letterfrack basket industry grew, Sophia Sturge soon discovered the biggest expense was purchasing willow rods to make the baskets, since the rods required weren't grown in sufficient quantity in Connemara. Joan Johnson.
She was buying in her willows. There was no willows up there growing naturally, so that was a big cost factor. So she decided that she'd sow her own. So she hired an osier from France who came over and stayed, and evidently he caused a great stir. He was the only Frenchman I'd say they'd ever seen. Anyway, I think he caused quite a stir, but he taught more work, and osiers, the rods, were planted.
The other thing is that the willows were grown locally. They weren't being imported. You know, she got slips or cuttings and then planted locally. And sometimes you'll still see some twigs or willows along hedgerows, and you'll see that they're a finer quality than a lot of the more rough willows or sallies, as they're usually called here. The usual sally rod of this country was Salix feminalis, which is a very big, chunky growing rod, a bit more like the type they now use for biomass. And that would have been perfect for creels, but wouldn't have been good for fine work. So it's left that little legacy too in the hedgerows still.
Connemara basket maker Joe Hogan. And aside from having to overcome the challenge of sourcing her own willow rods, Sophia also had to contend with Connemara's lack of a proper transport network at the time. Janet O'Toole of Connemara West Community Development Company.
One of the barriers to industry or setting up industry in places, far-flung places like northwest Connemara, is the fact of transport is always cited as a negative, and of course that means communications as well as, you know, raw materials and that kind of stuff as well. So I suppose it would have been quite a fair old task she set herself.
It's hard to know how she managed because everything was against her.
Letterfrack historian Pádraig Lydon.
It is said like that she brought the stuff in and out through Westport Quay, and to get it from Letterfrack, which is 32 miles, down to Westport Quay without damaging any of the stuff, and then exporting it to England to have it sold. I mean, the whole cost and then involvement in that. You know, there's a story told that she brought the old years in at Westport, and that the workers then had to go down and carry them up. And at that time, of course, this was now pre-everything that we know, really, pre the train and pre the roads. And there was very bad roads they complain about the roads nowadays, but there were no roads that time, and it was even said that so that the workers wouldn't get lost, that they would bring down fuchsia bushes with them down to Westport to mark the ground so that they'd know the way back.
So she was working 24 hours a day and very enthusiastic, and things were going very good, and the boys and their work with the baskets and the girls, and they had great fun doing it, and it was obviously bringing them money in, and she was training them in a skill.
Sophia Sturge was actually employing people and training them as well in a skill, and her idea was that people would have the skill. So I think, I admire her because she was a woman, and I think also because this whole idea of craft training and skills training, which we're kind of going back to again nowadays as well, which is a strange turnabout. Also, we have 2 of her chairs here in Letterfrack, made in the basket factory.
Her classes, she started with the youngsters. You can see the age they are. They might have been 14 or so. Now those people, if they hadn't gone there, they would have had nothing, really nothing. So it gave them a skill. It also gave them a small amount of money, and they gradually were trained in this skill. So that was the most important, I would think, influence that she had in the area. And again, she seemed to be a very enthusiastic woman, and seemed to value the connection that people had and with her. So I would think, as regards, she settled very well into the community and could communicate. She seemed to be a very good communicator.
Seats and baskets, tables and chairs, her staff soon learned new skills to raise their dreams with bright new scenes 'neath remote Connemara hills, weaving willow with willing hands that confidence instills.
As the months progressed, Sophia's trainees quickly graduated up the ranks of basketry, with some becoming masters of the craft. So just how good was their work? Connemara basket maker Joe Hogan.
I repaired 2 baskets, 2 armchairs in the late 70s or the early 80s that belonged to a woman called Mrs. Willoughby, and they were made at that basket making factory, as people tended to call it. All baskets are made by hand, but the factory refers to the fact that there was a whole load of people gathered together to make them. And these were white, as in stripped willow wicker armchairs. And the particular technique used was called fitching. And I have a basket here beside me which would show this. It shows you it's an open work. It means that the construction is very light to carry, and at that time most of the basket makers around here would have worked in unstripped material, which is natural willow, and most of my own work, for instance, is in natural willow as well. But the kind of fashion of the time would have been to take the skin off the willow and peel it, and that made it, if you like, more pleasing to kind of upper class clients. And it's hard to believe now, but I think the phrase they used to use, a lady's reticule, meaning some sort of a handbag. So it could have been that the Gucci handbag of the day was actually a handmade wicker basket, but extremely light, like very strong, but at the same time the willows all split and shaved and things like that. And I gather that the factory in Letterfrack aspired to that kind of taste, making high quality and very high quality baskets. And I think even to the point where some members of the British royalty must have bought some and formed a bit of a trend that it was a kind of a thing to have.
It was amazing the amount of items. I think there's something like 70 or so different types of baskets made. Some of the most intricate work was made in the chairs, But they made tables and they made all kinds of baskets of varying sizes and shapes. And these, of course, had to be exported then to be sold.
Letterfrack historian Pádraig Lydon. Here is Connemara historian Brendan O'Scannell to once more share his views.
The work that they were producing was of fantastic quality. I mean, I don't think anybody doubted any aspect of that. And, you know, as I say, we kind of tend to forget that basket making, wicker work, was being used in almost all sorts of walks of life. I mean, the baby's cradle was made out of, the Moses basket was made out of, was woven, you know, the stuff you use for going to the bog, the thing for the seaweed, the thing for the turf, but then also the really finer stuff. So you had beautiful trays, you had small furnishings, you had kind of wicker furniture to hang on your walls, like shelves and all this kind of stuff. So it was a real big catalogue of stuff that was available there. And there was probably quite a lot of very bad quality stuff being produced throughout the country. And I think the fact that she spent so much time and effort in training and making sure that the quality was always right, I think that really kind of helped her all along through the way.
The baskets made in the Letterfrack basket industry were definitely much more elaborate, in that sense, what's called fancy basketry amongst Irish professional basket makers. So it tended to be shopping baskets, furniture, things like that. But shopping baskets would possibly not quite catch what we're talking about. It would have been the market basket aimed at the very affluent, and I would think probably entirely for export to Britain.
Joe Hogan. And a vast variety of baskets produced by Letterfrack basket industry was described as follows by one visitor to Letterfrack in 1889.
The baskets that the boys make are of different sizes, the largest being about 1.25 feet long and 8 inches deep. The smallest are about 1/4 the size. The largest size is 3 shillings, or 3 shillings and sixpence. And when filled with moss and primroses, 3 shillings extra is charged for it. The smallest size is 1 shilling, or 1 shilling and sixpence, and 6 pence extra is charged for the filling. The girls who attended in the evenings made fancy baskets of Norwegian chip and of palm leaves from the West Indies. In all, about 65 items of wickerwork were made. Beside basket and hampers of all sorts were chairs, dog baskets, drawing room kennels, tea tables, hand carts, writing desks, cupboards, stools, bookstands and dolls' furniture.
And due to the continued success of Letterfrack basket industry, orders began to pour in for specialist basketry products, including a bridge. Joan Johnson.
They were obviously getting quite well established and inventive, and there was a request for a bridge being made. Obviously, one person was having difficulty crossing a local stream and had to make a detour, so they asked the factory to make a bridge across the bog. So this was made, and with much stronger willows and design, and was used until I think it actually eventually collapsed into the bog and had a death. And the other thing, and I would say this probably came from one of the la-di-da visitors that came, because they got quite well-to-do people coming down to have a look, and there was a request for a bath made out of basket.
That made out of basket, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that beats all. Of course, it would have had to be insulated correctly now, otherwise you might have had a wee bit of a leak.
Yes, so the structure was made, the willow was made, and the basket in the shape of a bath, and then they got rubber and they inserted a layer of rubber in. So somewhere in some fancy house, I could imagine, there was this willow bath. I'd say it was a one-off.
A lady came to Letterfrack from the city of Birmingham to weave a spell where hardship fell with a keen, industrious plan. to open the door with work for the poor, to raise up her fellow man.
It seems that there was a great demand for the baskets, and the records show that she earned over £250 the first year, and again the second year was somewhere similar. So there's an awful lot of baskets, somewhere in the region of 1,000 baskets a year were exported.
And key to such success was Sophia Sturge's supreme marketing skills. Connemara historian Brendan O'Scanall.
She was a very good marketeer. She obviously had a good network through the Quakers, the different families and all the different people she'd have contacts with. And we sometimes forget, I suppose, that the Quakers were well established in England and in Ireland, with not in the sense of the aristocracy or anything like that, but they had good connections to government and to people in power. So they were able to kind of use those contacts here in Ireland and in England to kind of get to the highest parts of society. And I mean, she managed to get one into the royal collection. I don't know if it's still there now or not, but it went into the royal household in some shape or form.
There is a little story about this girl, Margaret McDermott, who was one of her first students.
Historian Joan Johnson.
And she made this basket, and she put the Letterfrack emblem on it. And what they used to do is also they go out and pick moss and flowers and heathers and gorse and make an arrangement in the basket, and these would be sent off, and they would cost extra. And anyway, obviously, maybe Sophia was going on some visit back, but she brought Margaret's little basket, and she must have been going to a garden party or something, I can only guess, and Queen Alexandra was there and the basket was presented. But I think Sophia never missed a trick, I really do. I think she was really a marketing guru in her own time, and she was sending baskets out to the America. She was inviting people in to visit the enterprise here, and there's a list of people who were visiting, and they would all be encouraged to buy the baskets. And I mean, if she'd been on email or internet, she would have been there selling her baskets, I'd say.
And I think, that kind of idea of getting it to make sure that you got the proper people to be seen with it, and then people would feel, oh, well, it's okay then for us to buy the same. I mean, basket industry at the time and basket furniture and all that was very important. I mean, we kind of sometimes forget nowadays that we think of it as patio furniture only, but it was actually quite an important part of people's lives. Everything was done in wicker or so many different things. So I think she was in a good industry that people were looking for the product. It wasn't something that people didn't need. So I think once she got people to kind of understand that it was high quality and very special, that they were quite willing to buy. But I think the contacts that she had throughout England and Ireland with, not always through the Quaker families, but generally, I think that would have been a huge draw or a huge bonus for her, that she'd be able to kind of get into the right places and be seen at all the good places as well.
She had obviously connections in high places, because at one stage she had a display in a Bond Street shop, so she had connections and she used them.
And due to increased business, after 4 years, Sophia Sturge decided the industry needed a new premises. Joan Johnson.
4 years into the enterprise, they must have been still in the courthouse or in the environment there, and she decided that they needed to get the premises, proper premises. So she ordered a corrugated structure, which was ordered from Great Britain, and it was shipped over, and it was put up. It was like one of these prefabricated buildings, but they'd never seen the like of it over here before, and in fact they needed help. I think somebody had to come over and give them instructions as to how to put it together, a bit like Legoland, that kind of thing. But there was a base, and they built the base, and then they had to put this corrugated structure.
and the plot of land upon which Sophia Sturge built her new corrugated factory was purchased with the financial assistance of George Tanguy of Birmingham City. Sophia paid £20 for the 4-acre plot. On the 6th of January 1891, she received a clod of earth from the former occupier Michael Joyce as the customary symbol of the transfer of land rights. By the 1st of September of that same year, 1891, the building of the new basket factory premises was completed, and it was formally christened Shan Collier. Joan Johnson.
And it was beautiful. There's a lovely picture taken by Lawrence of this. And it had bay windows and it was green in colour and it was quite spacious. And that's where the factory then was permanently made. And it's out on the Connemara Road and there's very little of it left, in fact.
So just how important was Letterfrack basket industry as a community initiative? Brendan Wascanall.
Any industry would have been important to the community, but the fact that she wasn't just coming in as a kind of a business person, just taking the money and running, she was willing to plough the money back into the whole thing and to keep it going. Wages were very high in her industry as well, and she paid people really well for the work. Probably overpaid in a lot of cases.
And at this juncture I met up with Letterfrack historian Pádraig Lydon in his Letterfrack abode, where we examined the old wages records of Letterfrack basket industry. Pádraig, we're just looking at a document here now. Just give our listeners a word picture of what exactly we're looking at here at the moment.
Yeah, well, one thing about Sophia was that she kept detailed accounts of income and expenditure and the amount of money that was paid out each week to the workers. And we see here that the age of the workers ranged from 20 years down to 12. And she paid bubble rates to all of her workers, were 15 and older, were paid over 10 shillings a week, which would be somewhere like 6 or 7, I think, was the going rate at that time. And she had all of those people employed for about 6 or 7 years working in the factory for her. Now, again, you know, these are names that are still with us today or in the local area. You have Carneys, Gibbonses, Coynes, and Connellys, and I suppose they were Cornelius in those days, and McDonald's. They're all local names here at the moment, and I'm sure the ones we have now are the descendants of these people who work there.
The fact that she kind of allowed a lot of different families to survive and to keep living there, because emigration had always been a big issue, obviously, from Connemara, and it went on for centuries and still goes on. But without something like that, it would have been very difficult for an awful lot of people to live in the Letterfrack area. So by keeping people there, the sense of community built up, and the prosperity kind of allowed people to have better housing, to have more kind of go ahead, I suppose, themselves. So I think it just empowers people to survive in their own area. And I mean, I suppose that's the big thing. Like, you know, people often talk about community development, but without the people, community development doesn't happen. And you need to have a solid base of people who have skills, but who have a little bit of, I don't mean necessarily money, but who have at least a bit of a disposable income that they can help out. And then that it'll kind of, one thing will feed into another.
It was fantastic while it lasted. It was... I mean, it employed a whole village of people in that a lot of them were from more or less from the same area, but all of them were trained by her, and all of them turned out to be great workers.
Sophia Sturge started her basket industry in Letterfrack in the year 1888. Unfortunately, by 1895, over 7 years later, she began suffering from ill health and burnout. Historian Brendan Wascanall.
Her industry, of course, worked really well for the first few years. She was there for 7 to 8 years, and the big thing was that she gave too much of herself. I mean, it goes back again to that you put so much effort into things. I mean, I suppose if she had been, again, more of a business person and wasn't as interested in the community aspect of it, it might have lasted longer. But the fact that she had been spending so much time, effort, money, and her own personal space, I suppose, was just constantly being used by it. And then, of course, the death of her mother affected her as well. So I think just overall she just wore out, basically. Just burnout, I suppose. So you can't really put all your effort into one thing and then, not expect something to go wrong.
She got burnt out, and her ill health, and she was recommended to stop, or else she would have burnt herself out.
Historian Joan Johnson.
So after 7 years, now she started in 1888, and so by the mid-1890s, she was having to think of going home, and she was desperately disappointed, but she did secure a manager, and she hoped that manager would have continued on, and there was great hopes for it, and she kept an interest in it, but she had to leave. But there was a visit from the Congested District Board officer there, and he gave a report, and it said that the eventual failure to continue this development was due to 3 points. One was the withdrawal of the founder's personal enthusiasm. 2, the manager proved unequal to the task. And 3, the skilled workers had emigrated. So it came to a close. And that episode of her Letterfrack life ended. Now she went home, and she obviously recovered. She went home to Birmingham and lived there. She lived with her brother, and then the First World War came, and she became very interested in the campaigning for peace. I mean, Joseph Sturge was also a peace campaigner. He'd gone off to the Tsar of Russia and had gone on a peace mission, and so it was very strong in the family, and so she involved herself with that work and continued right to the end, till she died in 1936, and worked for international peace through reconciliation, and that would have been a Quaker fundamental principle. And she would have lobbied and had strong connections with the government as well, and she was highly regarded as a speaker. And she spoke to many public groups and into universities, into schools, on peace and reconciliation as the way forward.
But did she ever marry Joan?
No, she didn't. And that surprised me, because she was a fine, striking lady, and we have some photographs of her in her early years and later years, but no.
Also, for the remainder of her life, Sophia Sturge became a leading advisor to other community activists, initiating basket-making enterprises and cottage industries in the United Kingdom. When she died in 1936, her long obituary in the Birmingham Post newspaper barely mentioned her philanthropic work among the poor of Letterfrack in Connemara during the 1880s and 1890s. Instead, it focused on her work to foster world peace. Nevertheless, among the people who worked in Sophia Sturge's Letterfrack basket industry, the warm memory of her selfless giving and hard work to improve their community burned bright within their hearts. Since what you do for yourself dies with you, but what you do for others lives forever. So what was Sophia Sturge's ultimate legacy to Letterfrack? Connemara historian Brendan O'Scannall.
The legacy that Sophia left, I think the biggest thing was to allow people to stay in the area. Emigration was the big problem for, the hemorrhage of people out of an area just sapped out all the good. And the fact that young people particularly were allowed to live in their own area gave it a kind of a head start on quite a lot of other places where people were actually leaving. So Letterfrack in that particular area had a kind of a good population. And I think the fact that the industry, the style, I suppose, of how she was doing things was there, people were willing to try other things as well. So I think her big legacy would be to give people a bit of self-confidence to try something themselves, but also to keep the viable population there so that when things started to pick up a little bit, I suppose it took a long time for it to happen, but when it did, that there were enough people kind of living around to actually make it a viable situation for people to come in with other ideas as well.
The self-help ethos of the Quakers, and in particular Sophia Sturge, would be very evident in this particular area.
Janet O'Toole of Connemara West Community Development Company, based in Letterfrack.
There is a lot of community development organisations. There's a lot of people involved. I mean, as there is everywhere, and I wouldn't like. We're not claiming to be the world's most volunteers or whatever, but there is a great attitude of, like, if people want something done, they usually try and get together and then eventually see after, what they can do. And I think Connemara West would epitomise that. And Connemara West is a community development company which was set up in the Renval, Kylemore, Letterfrack and Moyard area. So it's called the Parish of Ballinakil in 1971. And it's a locally owned development company owned by the local people. And in fact, a nice story, when the idea of setting up the company to build holiday cottages in Tullycross village, it was decided, instead of letting, say, local businessmen or just invest in it, that it would go out to the whole of the area. And they did a door-to-door collection in 1971 and collected £13,000. So that became the company, and then the company was set up like a cooperative. And a decision was made that no directors would be paid, and that all monies made would be reinvested back into the company, so that there would be no dividend to shareholders.
And what, if any, is the big lesson which we have to learn from Sophia Sturge's many years of hard work in Letterfrack? Joe Hogan.
Well, definitely her actions were admirable, and I suppose if it has implications for us today, it's to kind of look outside our own country, to look within our own country first, I suppose, and have fairer distribution of wealth, but probably also to look to how countries in the third world are treated, I suppose, and that for most people, I think they would prefer work rather than charity. That has implications for those trade organisation talks and everything, which I think we get squeezed out of quite a bit, human beings, because they seem to be more about organisations.
I think the lesson that we learn, really, I suppose, is that no matter how small our effort is, we have a very valid or valuable role to play in society. We overlook, I think, sometimes the very simple ideas, and we kind of go, if it isn't complicated or really difficult, it shouldn't happen. And I don't think anything that Sophia did was that complicated. Maybe she wasn't complicated enough to actually succeed in some ways. But I think that the idea really is that we all can make a difference. But also I think it's a fact that you don't just throw money at people. I don't think I think that all of the Quaker aspect of our history, I suppose, here has been that situation, that it's always been to do with giving people employment, giving people dignity. And I suppose when we look at the world around us and we look at how we treat charity or kind of foreign aid in other places, we're always kind of just throwing money at the African situation or the Indian situation or wherever it may be, without actually looking at the people's real needs. And the people's real needs are for dignity, for work, for community. And I think until we can kind of look at that aspect and put it in, and I think Sophia, that was one of her big ideas, is that, it would have been easier probably for her to stay at home and just send over a few €100 or £100 every year to keep Letterfrack alive, but it wouldn't have done anything for the population. So I really think that her coming here and working with people and giving them that kind of quality of life is something that we really should take forward ourselves. And as I say, no matter how small our efforts, I think they're very important for other people. We mightn't see it ourselves, but other people seeing somebody spending time with them certainly would help give them self-esteem.
Brendan O'Scanall. And historian Joan Johnson also had the following story to share about Sophia Sturge and one of her students in Letterfrack. By the way, Joan makes reference to the biography which William R. Hughes wrote and published of Sophia Sturge's life in 1940.
I came across again in Hughes a letter written by Margaret McDermott, who lived obviously in the environment of Letterfrack, and on her death people were asked to write in their memories of Sophia, and I'd like to read this one from Margaret Dermott, who wrote in October 1939 from a room in New York decorated with photographs of Sophia Sturge. I was only a child going to school one morning when I met this beautiful lady, a beautiful tall lady. She spoke to me, asked my name, gave my cheek a pinch and said, would I come down that night to the hotel? I was delighted. Now this was the hotel where the basket lessons were being taught. I was delighted and went to the hotel so many nights each week, with others, for a long time. Later on, Miss Sturge got a house put up over the lake. I think she brought it from England. There was quite a few boys going there, learning to make wicker work of all kinds. I was the only girl going over to the house. I loved the work and learned quickly. After some time I made a very pretty basket with Connemara printed on one end and Letterfrack on the other. Miss Sturge had it presented to Queen Alexandra. She told me afterwards the Queen was very pleased. When we first started in the hotel, there was a courthouse beside the hotel. In that courthouse, Miss Sturge taught us. One day, Miss Sturge went out to the hotel for something. We all started to jump around, some of us standing on the table, making believe we were trying cases, because they were in the courthouse, I suppose. I looked towards the door, and there Miss Sturge stood looking at us and trying to look cross. She said, when the cat goes out, the mice began to play. I'll never forget her as she stood there looking at us. Her face is still before me. She was so kind to us and so patient. She had the kindest and sweetest face I ever saw. I could never put into words or tell you how I felt towards Miss Sturge. The time came when she told me she was leaving for good. She wore a little watch pinned on her dress. She took it off and pinned it on me when she said goodbye. I thought my life was over. I cried so much I don't know how I ever got home through the bogs down to Bonnabuckie. There are lots of nice things had happened between us, and what I have written is the best I can remember. Margaret McDermott emigrated to America, and many years later she paid a visit to England. I wrote and told Miss Sturge. She came to London. We met outside the Hotel Claridge's and had tea together. What a great many years had gone by since we had first met, when I was only a child. Her face had never changed to me. You will be tired reading this, but I hope to be forgiven. I loved her so much I can never tire speaking about her. I refer to her work in the First World War, and she developed and became a skilled lobbyist in this field to the highest level amongst the government official. Hughes, who wrote her memoir, states as follows: the dignity of her bearing commanded attention, while her pertinent questions drew response even from the dullard and the socially retiring. I remember at a political party watching her in conversation with an ex-Prime Minister, his figure bending over to her above the roar and listening with grave attention to what one felt sure was admonition. Here's another comment from somebody who remembers her. She ever bore about her the stamp of serenity and goodness, and no one could see her make an entrance without knowing that a presence of commanding character had appeared on the scene. Hughes's final sentence ends as a fitting tribute to the memory of Sophia Sturge as follows: "Every noble life leaves the fibre of it interwoven forever in the work of the world."
A lady came to Letterfrack from the city of Birmingham to weave a spell where hardship fell with a keen industrious plan, to open the door with work for the poor and raise up her fellow man. To Connemara's rocky land Sophia made her way. In hungry times where hardship chimes, remembered still to this day, to weave a track to Letterfrack and offer a fair week's pay. From Quaker stock of servitude, devoted piety, to basket making in the hills, to set the destitute free, with a firm desire to raise them higher, with willow her industry. Seats and baskets, tables and chairs, her staff soon learned new skills, to raise their dreams with brighter scenes neath remote Connemara hills. Weaving willow with willing hands that confidence instills. Yes, a lady came to Letterfrack from the city of Birmingham to weave a spell where hardship fell with a keen industrious plan, to open the door with work for the poor and raise up her fellow man. For 7 long years she stayed out west to raise the hopes of the poor. But sad was the day she went away through sickness and grief's dark door. Though her dreams became a reality, improving the lives of the poor. Yes, her dreams became a reality, improving the lives of the poor.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.